Verity, welcome to tr1block.com. Now, let me open our conversation with this. Setting a strategic agenda for sustainable development in any company is no easy task. Yet SSP as a business are placing sustainability front and centre, and over the last 2 years have taken many measurable sustainable actions. 3 months ago, you published a book-like sustainability report, which goes into great detail on company purpose, values, targets, and ambitions. Just briefly, some words about SSP itself. It's a $2.6 billion company and operates as one of the world's leading companies in the food travel sector across 35 countries, spanning 6 continents with around 2,600 units. The business itself straddles airports, rail, shopping centres, hospitals, motorway service stations, as well as onboard catering for airlines and tour operators. The scale of your business is impressive, but the enormity of the scale of implementing your strategy must really be quite a challenge. Can I start by asking what the key pillars are of sustainability for SSP?
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here today. So thinking about SSP, I think we always have had a long history of each local business focusing on social and environmental initiatives, but they were very kind of locally led and driven. And what happened during the pandemic, it sort of tested the business in many ways, but it also kind of gave that opportunity for the business to step back and start really thinking about sustainability and how we make it part of our DNA, as you say, front and centre of what we're doing, of our strategy. So at the end of 2021, we launched our first ever global sustainability strategy. And I think crucially, that does cover the global business. It's not, specific to certain regions or countries, and is really supported by clear and measurable targets, global targets focused on the most material issues for our stakeholders. So our strategy itself is kind of structured under 3 key pillars. First pillar is about serving our customers responsibly. So it's essentially about the food we serve, about the products that we put across in our brands. The second pillar is about protecting our environment, so really that planet piece. And the third area is about supporting our colleagues and communities. So it's essentially the 3 Ps of product, planet, and people. And then really crucially, which I think some people forget in the sort of sustainability space, but is actually one of the most important areas, is underpinning all of that with really high standards of governance. So if you see our strategy, you see a nice wheel with the 3 segments of the wheel, but governance right at the centre. And that is actually really crucial to the work too.
Okay, let's just focus on a few things that come out from what you just said. I mean, the core of your vision is to deliver good tasting, nutritious and sustainable food for, as you said, people and planet in the food travel sector. But can you please provide some examples of where you've actually introduced this?
Yeah, so I think just firstly, that focus on the sort of great tasting, nutritious and sustainable food, I think is just really core to what we do. There's a lot of issues in our strategy that you will see in the strategy of many, many other companies. But really, ultimately, it's about the food we serve and how we make that, firstly, great tasting. Customers need to want to choose these products and choose this food. We want to make it healthier and nutritious. Obviously, there's a lot of concern in the world at the moment around obesity or other kind of conditions associated with the food we eat. And thirdly, that planetary piece. And I think what we're seeing is actually that how that integrated approach comes together. In the past, you might have had one area of the business thinking about nutrition and health and another area of the business thinking about sustainability and environmental impacts. But I think a lot of the thinking in recent years has brought those elements together. So what is a healthier food for people is often actually healthier for the planet too. It's more sustainable, it's lower carbon emissions. We know that if we eat less red meat, we reduce our risk of heart disease, diabetes, but it's actually far lower carbon emissions than you would get with plant-based or fish or even poultry, for example. So we're really looking at the whole kind of how we design our recipes, how we design our menus, how we incentivize consumers, and what ranges we can introduce. I think crucially, you can't force this stuff upon people, and that's where the great tasting bit comes in. You've got to make these dishes, first and foremost, really appealing and great tasting. So the meat eaters want to go for the maybe more plant forward or plant-based dish as much as the vegetarians and vegans, and thereby helping them in health and sustainability. So we've got lots of examples around the business, looking at individual brands, looking at individual recipes, where we've just tweaked recipes slightly that might.
Let's have some examples. Where?
So there's a lot of work being done in the Nordics around this. So for example, take the classic shrimp sandwich in the Nordics. That's something that's very popular. We'll see it across many of our different units in the Nordics. And what we did is a little bit of kind of recipe engineering. So we looked at that sandwich and said, okay, if we just reduce the shrimp by a certain amount, introduced more spinach, some egg protein, some salmon as well, what that did was actually create a great tasting, better tasting dish that proved more popular with the customers because it had kind of more taste and variety and a good balance of those tastes, but also actually resulted in significant carbon reductions just from that one dish, because not all things are equal. I think people might think that it's just about vegan food or going all plant-based. It's not. When you look at shrimp, it has much higher carbon emissions than, for example, salmon. So it's looking at those kind of lower carbon options. The other thing they've done in the Nordics is develop this thing called what's known as their Better Choice range. So the idea is this is a range of products that they use across quite a number of different brands that might be, say, meat-free, plant-based, but also looking at those health impacts as well, high in fiber, more nutritious, and developing a really clear labeling system for those products to help customers make informed choices. That was originally started in one single brand in the Nordics. It's proved so successful. We've rolled it out across multiple of our own brands in the region. And now we've also actually started engaging with some of our franchise brand partners who are introducing the range themselves. So it's really showing the success of that dish and just providing a simple way for customers to understand, actually, this is a better dish for people and planet.
Well, don't be shy about naming the brand names. Please, let's have a few of the restaurants that feature these new recipes.
Yes, I know one of the franchises we've introduced it to is Eatery, which is a brand we operate in Sweden. So they've introduced it. And in terms of our own brands, Ritatsa is one of our big brands that we have across the Nordics and in lots of other markets. It's been introduced there, to our upper crust brands, and then also to our more kind of bespoke Nordics brands, some of which I probably can't pronounce because they have.
All right.
I wouldn't want to try to.
So let's just move on. I mean, how do you actually then educate your customers on climate smart food?
I mean, if I had the answer to that straight away, then I think, I would have sold it all for the whole industry. So I think this is a very kind of nascent area. So think about all the work that's happened over the last 20 years in terms of educating people about health and nutrition of what they're eating. And we've seen the whole raft of reams of different forms of voluntary labeling, all going through the different cycles, it almost becoming too confusing for consumers, I think, at some point with so many different labeling systems to what almost it's now moved to as a regulatory aspect within the UK, at least where you have to have the nutritional calorie allergen labeling on all your menus and all your products. So I think if you think about it in that kind of health terms, that it's taken about 20 years to get to the right solution or something that works. I think, the climate carbon labeling area is a lot more in the early stages, but it can actually hopefully accelerate from learning from what's happened in the nutritional and health space. So you are seeing some trials going on at the moment. We're looking at introducing carbon labeling on menus. So a simple sort of red, amber, green, if you order the steak, that's a high carbon dish. If you order the plant-based, meat-free salad or something like that, that's a lower carbon dish. But I think also, from my perspective, I'm not sure that kind of overwhelming customers and consumers with lots of labeling and sort of almost kind of, what's the word? Sort of basically, constantly preaching to them about what they want to eat. I think that can fall flat and actually have a sort of negative effect ultimately. So the way I see it, it goes back to that point that we said at the beginning. It's all about great tasting dishes. If you make these dishes really appealing to customers that they want to buy it. If they just happen to be healthier and lower carbon, that's great. Everybody wins. It's not something you necessarily need to preach to consumers. And in my opinion, in my view, I think too much pressure is put on, oh, it's just down to the customers to change. They've got to change everything about the brand. We've got to kind of lead them as well a little bit, but that's not necessarily just with labeling. It's just by making really amazing food that they want to buy.
Okay. Now, let's just talk briefly about the supply chain. I mean, as a business, something just under 80% of your total carbon footprint relates to food and beverage and products you purchase for resale. Now, I understand that rightly many of your suppliers are local, but what percentage are abiding by your code of practice when it comes to sourcing products?
So we currently have a number of policies that we ask our suppliers to sign up to, including an ethical trade code of conduct and human rights policy, a responsible sourcing policy, environment policy, and farm animal welfare. Our target is for 100% of our contracted suppliers to have signed up to that by 2025, and we're making really good progress.
That's an ambitious target.
It's an ambitious target, but actually, a lot of it is, these kind of, when we talk about, these policies and the codes, it's ours or equivalent standards. So it's about the provisions within those policies rather than the document itself. And what you actually find now is most suppliers, pretty much most suppliers out there have some kind of code of conduct themselves. They're already being asked by other customers for this kind of thing. So I'd say 10 years ago, that was very, very challenging. And I've worked in this field a long time and I've seen how that's changed. But I think it's become more commonplace. It's more mainstream now. And a lot of suppliers are being more proactive at just setting their own standards and being able to demonstrate those to their customers. But I think the work in terms of carbon emissions and actually measuring performance there, that's a bit of a different thing. It's not so much about a sort of compliance monitoring exercise. It's really about that sort of collaborative working of how you kind of work with your suppliers to say, okay, this is where we're trying to reduce emissions. This is our targets. This is our goals. Where are we aligned? Where can we come together? Where can we support one another? And also encouraging them to bring more sustainable solutions, more eco-friendly solutions to us that we can then implement. A really good example is, for example, cleaning chemicals. We purchase a lot of cleaning chemicals. We're a food company, but that's actually something that we buy a lot of. And actually, these chemicals can have quite high emissions factors associated with them. We have a global cleaning product supplier. We went to them and said, okay, this is the challenge we've got. Can you help us? And they actually came back with, we've just developed this new range. They've got all the life cycle analysis data to show the emissions reduction with the range they introduced. We did a trial in our UK units last year, proved very successful, and would now be looking at rolling that out. So then what you're able to do is, in terms of calculating your emissions, you're able to kind of say, okay, we're still purchasing the same amount of cleaning chemicals, but we know that the emissions factors are a lot lower for that. So that's how you kind of track it. So you look at project by project in terms of tracking it through. I think it's an area that we need to get more sophisticated on. And I don't think any one organisation has got the ultimate solution. I think, I'm inundated every day with people trying to sell me data systems that are apparently going to solve all my problems and all my reporting needs. Obviously, that's great, but it's only as good as the information that people put in and you get out of it. So I think it's really more about that engagement side of things. And then really thinking about with your supply selection right from the outset of, making sure that we're choosing to work with suppliers that already have strong sustainability credentials in place too.
Well, just talking about engagement and developing this point, SSP has identified various stakeholder groups, how you engage with them, and the top 5 material sustainability issues. And I just want to focus on 3 of these groups in particular: your clients, your brand partners, and your customers. Just how different do you look at each of these respective groups?
I think It's quite a hard question to answer because there's obviously lots of complexities to it. I think there's a lot of synergies between those groups in terms of the kind of issues that matter to them and that are important to them. And the kind of, you see a lot of alignment between, the top issues are very much kind of, maybe a couple of years ago might have been more around plastics or packaging. You're now seeing like climate change really move up on people's agenda as there's that sort of growing awareness of the climate emergency and how important that is. So really thinking about those environmental impacts, but also the kind of ethical standards that relate to products and brands as well. People, this is where success of certification like fair trade and all of that kind of stuff is actually really successful and really important, because again, it gives them an easy way for people to understand that those standards have been met for those products and ingredients. I think what's different is whilst the issues might be very similar, I think they will view from a different lens. And that's the key thing. So your clients and your brand partners are going to be looking a lot more from a commercial and a compliance lens. Whereas for your customers, they're going to be more thinking about, well, is this a product I want to choose? Is this a brand I want to give my money to? Is this or for our colleagues even, is this an organization I want to work for? So, and that will be offset often, particularly in the customer space, about thinking about quality and value for money, particularly now we're in the cost of living crisis. You can ask lots of questions to customers of, do they want to choose sustainable brands over non-sustainable ones? And the majority will say yes. But then when you ask the question, well, are you willing to pay more? Are you willing to pay a premium? Those percentages will go down significantly. So it's about balancing those needs. And I think the same, in a way, could be said for clients and brand partners. It's, we're not non-profit organizations. We still need to create value for our shareholders as much as our other stakeholders. So anything we do around sustainability does need to be commercially viable. So I think the way in which you engage with those stakeholders is just kind of shifting your angle and your objective in those conversations. It might be talking to a client about how we can support them in delivering shared goals, how we can meet different objectives they have, how we can help enhance their reputation as well as ours. With brand partners, it's thinking about how do we create that real sustainable brand proposition that attracts that kind of new generation of conscious consumers. So it's that kind of commercial lens, bringing that into the conversation and not just making it seem all nice to have fluffy sustainability things that actually has no influence on the bottom line.
So moving on, do you find that you are more and more of the influencer to your client base, and specifically airports I have in mind here, to adopt sustainable actions? Or are you now finding that airports are actually embedding sustainability as a key area for adoption in their respective tenders for business?
I think it's a bit of both. So we're certainly seeing more and more clients, and it's increasing rapidly, introduce sustainability requirements into tenders or as conditions of contracts that we go into, or even introducing, programs within the sites with incentives for their concessions. We've seen that in terms of like green point systems being introduced for operators that undertake certain sustainability actions. And I think a lot of the sort of increase in seeing those kind of requirements was one of the impetus as well for developing our strategy and launching that back in 2021. But I think also there's a lot of airports that may say, okay, yes, we're focused on sustainability, but they haven't quite got down to the practicalities of that or where they really need to get into it. So they might focus on the really kind of tangible, obvious things like plastics or packaging or waste management on the site, but they haven't really got a handle necessarily on more complex issues, for instance, around net zero, particularly in the whole kind of sourcing side of things. So I think what we're seeing is that a client might want to talk to us about a specific topic. I was in a client meeting just last week where they wanted to talk to us specifically about cups and, how we can get rid of as much single-use cups used on the site. And that was a very specific initiative that they were looking to trial. But we took that opportunity to say, okay, that's great. Of course, we can support you in this.
That's barely
Is a lot
scratching the
of
surface,
learning.
is it? Barely scratching the surface.
Yes, exactly. And then we said to them, actually, we've also done this massive amount of work for our net zero ambition. We've mapped our entire carbon footprint, including across our entire value chain as well. And we're really working on developing those kind of, in practical terms, what a sustainable F&B proposition looks like for those airports. And I think that's where you suddenly see them get quite excited, because what I think I've worked in sustainability for nearly 20 years, and in my experience, it's people, of course, want to do it. It's the right thing to do. They're interested in it. I've never come across anyone who said, absolutely, no, we're not interested and we're not doing that. But it's also quite conceptual. It's quite hard for people to get their heads around. It's quite technical in a lot of places, and it's quite hard to understand what are the real practical, tangible things we can do. And that goes for the own business as well as, with our clients as well. So I think a lot of my job is translating all that kind of technical information, that complex information, and bringing those practical solutions. And I think the fact that we've worked with some very progressive airports who are really forward thinking on sustainability has also given us a lot of experience of learning what works and what doesn't, how it, and I think in a way, that means SSP is in quite a unique position. We're working with some of the most forward-thinking sustainability focused airport clients in the world, and also some of the ones that it's not even really on their radar yet, and they've no idea even where to start. So we can take a lot of those learnings and that experience from those forward-thinking clients, what we've gone through, what works, what doesn't, and take those to influence some of those clients. They're all right at the beginning of their journey, and actually, in my experience, they're very happy to get someone coming to them proactively with those kind of solutions. And it's something we want to do a lot more of sharing that best practice across the global business.